Welcome back, everyone. I'm Molly Keener, Director of Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communication at ZSR Library, and I am happy to welcome you to the final session of our DH at Wake Summer Institute. We have Shelley Sizemore with us today for the session Working with Community Partners, Tips and Strategies. Shelley serves as the Director of Community Partnerships in the Office of Civic and Community Engagement at Wake Forest University. In her role, she builds relationships with community partners, connects faculty, staff, and students to community-based work, and works to measure the impact of partnerships between Wake Forest and the community. She directs the ACE Fellows program. ACE stands for Academic and Community Engagement. For faculty interested in community-based teaching and research, the Summer Nonprofit Immersion Program, SNIP, and DashCore, a project-based learning program. As Shelley is presenting, please enter questions you have for her in the Q&A box. There will be a moderated Q&A at the conclusion of her talk. So, welcome, Shelley.
Thanks, Molly. And thank you all so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you today and to be here at the end of what looked like a pretty exciting and awesome lineup of folks. So I will get started, go ahead and get started and share a little bit around just what we're going to cover today. So I tried to think about one of the requests that I got from the staff in Digital Humanities was to think about just what are things that, you know, I regularly get asked by faculty and others that I'm working with in a community-based context, and what are some of the things that I've learned over the course of the last 10, 11, 12 years of doing community engagement work in a higher education context. And so I've kind of thought through that and am responding with the following pieces. So first, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about successful partnerships and how we might trouble the way that we define them or expand the way we define them. I'm going to share some guiding values for community engagement and for community-based work that I use in my work, that we specifically use in the community partnerships area of OCCE, and that are informed by the Office of Civic and Community Engagement's broader kind of value statements for working with community partners and doing community-based work. I'm going to highlight two kind of strategies, one around critical question asking and another around using asset and power mapping to better understand the communities that we're working with. And then I'll end with some tips for getting engaged. And that is kind of like really just a repository laundry list type situation of things that, you know, I consistently have told folks over the years and have learned from folks over the years. So an ideal partnership for our work is defined as a space where both or all partners are able to learn and grow capacity by leveraging their knowledges, skills, and strengths. And so you'll hear a lot about, or I'll talk a lot about collaboration is really what is undergirding all of this work. And collaboration is actually a pretty high watermark. We like to use that term a lot to just describe anything that's done with other people. But as I'm sure you've experienced in your career, in your personal life, just because there's other people involved does not mean the work is collaborative. And so that's something I just want us to kind of hold on to for the duration of the presentation. And as you're thinking about your work, is really collaborative work is work where people are able to participate and engage kind of on equal footing, and where all parties are getting something out of the partnership and are offering something in the partnership. This has not historically been the story of higher education and community engagement work, which many of you may already know, and we can talk more about. I decided not to spend a ton of time on kind of the historiography of community engagement work in higher education, but historically, up until about the last decade or decade and a half, most of the community engagement work that higher education kind of embarked upon, talked about, did was pretty unidirectional, was pretty like, we are the experts, we are coming into the community and we are going to help you or fix things. And the field has really moved away from that and has really identified some of the, by naming some of the problematic relationships and dynamics that can come out of that framing into this place that really forefronts reciprocity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Unfortunately, sometimes we, in addition to kind of the challenge of thinking that we're the expert going into the community to fix things, we also sometimes define success by one measure and forget the others. And what I mean by that is community engagement, community-based work in higher education is very unique because it exists at a pretty particular intersection of student learning, of the generation and production of knowledge and new ways of thinking about knowledge that is the historical work of universities and colleges, and of community-based change work. And a lot of times we kind of focus on one of those pieces or forefront them, and I'm really going to encourage us to think about all three at an intersection. I also failed to mention at the beginning that I have a 4.5-year-old, and I don't think he's going to join us on the call, but because there's always the possibility, I just like to give people a heads up. Just pretend like it's not happening. We'll keep moving. So I mentioned a little bit kind of that there's three kind of buckets that we can use as measures for success when we're thinking about community engagement work. One is the learning or curricular or research outcomes of a project. The second is the student or faculty or staff skill utilization or growth. And then the third is organizational improvement, nonprofit capacity building for the organizations we're working with. I wanted to name that a lot of times what is the pretext and in the back of our mind is long-term community change as a goal. And that can be a good framing and a good kind of framework for doing this work. And I'm going to talk as this goes on more and more about really setting realistic and operationalizable expectations, goals, and outcomes for the work that we're doing with community partners. And so I think, it's important to name that long-term community change is, of course, kind of a lot of times the broader goal that we're like stepping into when we're doing community-based work in higher education, but it's really rare for that to happen within the course of like one class or one project, or even like the course of a career, to be honest. And so I wanted to both acknowledge that those goals are there, but also name that that's not really often the most immediate way that we can measure success for individual projects. So the values that I wanted to highlight, I'm just going to walk through each of these and talk about what they mean and provide some examples. So the first is integrity. And what that means in this context is that we do what we say we will do, which means that we set realistic goals and we're transparent about those goals, and that we invite accountability. So it's one thing to say, let me know if this isn't what you had hoped for. And it's another thing to create frameworks from the very beginning that really invite negative feedback as well as positive. And at every point throughout this, we really are thinking about power, and particularly we're thinking about the historical power dynamic between institutions of higher education and the communities that they sit in. There is almost always disparate power in that context, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, are aware of. That is particularly pronounced when you have, for instance, at Wake Forest, a predominantly white institution that is working a lot with, or working often with, communities of color and in communities of color, right? So really being the important piece around this accountability is that really acknowledging those imbalances, acknowledging our positionality and kind of the overlay of all these different kind of power dynamics, and using that to create a feedback loop that really not only invites feedback, but kind of ensures that there's not going to be harm or blowback for a nonprofit or a community member sharing feedback that we may not like. So the second piece is reciprocity. So with reciprocity, we're talking about a context in which all stakeholders are able to identify what they want to learn and what they are prepared to teach. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about the rise of this language of co-educator, but that is something that has been a really pronounced kind of shift in like the rhetoric and language of community engagement in higher education, is this move towards thinking about nonprofit partners not only as kind of service learning placements or thought partners, but also as co-educators that are kind of helping us to think through like what is the most important knowledge that our students need in order to be effective in the spaces that they're in. So empathy, a lot of people talk about empathy. I know that we all have a definition of empathy. The important thing that I wanted to highlight here is that what empathy looks like in community-based work is that you are forefronting listening, and you are centering others' experiences in your knowledge of what is going on in a community, and what challenges are there and what strengths are there. And so again, it's this kind of attitude of openness, this attitude of like taking folks' word for it that you're working with, that their experience is in fact valid. So I include community, which may seem a little redundant, but that's intentional, because community, just because we have a goal of community doesn't mean we're doing it in the pursuit of that goal. And so when we think about community and community building in our office, and particularly in the relationship building work we do with community partners, we think about community as both a process and a goal, which is borrowing from Leanne Bell's definition of social justice as both a process and a goal, where she basically argues that if our goal, that a lot of spaces that have the goal of social justice don't necessarily have justice in their processes, or in their organizing, or things like that. And so we want to do the same thing with community, and with community building. If we say that that is our goal, then we should be thinking about ways within a class that we can build community amongst participants and members, how we can build community between ourselves and the community partners outside of our teaching or research. We really want to make sure that those things are congruent, the process and the goal. And that relates directly to equity. So equity is, in community engaged work, means that we have an intentional power analysis in our work, and a focus on dismantling systems of oppression. And if we can't get to dismantling immediately, again, there's like big change goals versus smaller change goals, that we're at least making sure that our analysis of those systems is present, and that we're not kind of operating in a space without any sort of analysis. A really good example of this in our work in the Office of Civic and Community Engagement is related to our food justice work, our food security work. So in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, many of you may know, we have really high rates of food insecurity, and we have many food deserts. So food deserts around the county. A popular thing for students to say is that Forsyth County is a food desert. That's not accurate. There are neighborhoods within Forsyth County that are food deserts, and then there are neighborhoods that have 7 grocery stores. So it's also important to acknowledge, those disparities in access. But what that looks like in our kind of what equity can look like in food justice work is we have a large project called the Campus Kitchen, and the Campus Kitchen is not turning the food system, the industrial food system, on its head. It's not, dismantling that fully, but it is leveraging a very specific resource on campus and creating spaces where students can get that resource to the organizations that are trying to fight food insecurity and create a more just food system in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County. And so as a part of that, we talk openly with students that are on that leadership team, that are our volunteers, that are our leaders, about the food system. And we talk about what Campus Kitchen's role is in trying to shift it as a thought leader. And so that's a way that you can still find an opportunity to talk about equity and to talk about systems, even if you're not going to have the timeline or the skill set to totally disrupt them, in the next 6 months to a year. Another important tenet of community engagement and partnership development is flexibility. So, and I wanted to highlight this in particular because I think this is where we see one of the many ways that the humanities is uniquely positioned to really be excellent, to really be an excellent partner to community-based work. Because community engaged work, and I have a bit of a bias here, which I probably should have named at the beginning, which is that my research background is humanities based. So I have a little bit of a bias, but what I've found that civic engagement work is discursive and iterative. And so in order to be able to do equitable, just community engagement work, we have to be prepared to hear about ourselves. We have to be prepared to shift when something's not working. We have to be prepared to reinvent the work that we're doing when there's a change in the community. Everyone has to be flexible, in particular the groups with the most power. And this is a great moment to see that. Whether it's looking at the response to COVID or looking at the response to the growing kind of national awareness around racial inequity. In order for our work to be valuable, we have to be able to respond to changing needs of a community. And sometimes a response can look like not doing something anymore. I personally will share that I am pursuing a PhD, and I do community-based research, and I got IRB approval the day before the stay-at-home order. And then for my dissertation project, and then the stay-at-home order completely shifted the ability for my project to happen, but also whether or not the communities I was working with even had the capacity to engage at the same level in the work that I was planning and hoping to do. And so I didn't do it. I pressed pause. And there are other examples of faculty that I've worked with in the past that have made that hard decision. And I'm naming that, knowing that that can create a real tension for faculty because of kind of the need there to produce scholarship and to produce it on a particular timeline. And so I think I also don't have clean answers to all of this. It's a little bit messy, so I will name that as a tension. And then finally, we have to have patience. So that means for me, realistic and shared timelines. I'm the type of person that kind of still will expect that I can change things very quickly and fix things very quickly. And I have just learned over time that is often not helpful. Both to building relationships, but also to strategic, systemic, long-term change. So when I talk about engaging different stakeholders, and I mentioned earlier kind of those 3 ways of measuring success, I've provided some critical questions. I find it helpful to use question asking because it really creates space to listen, but also because it can really help individuals to name things up front that can really make for a better partnership. A lot of the mistakes that we make in community engagement work are out of a place of positive intent. But what we know about intent is that it doesn't really matter if the impact is bad. And so these questions or is harmful. These questions can help us identify, both to name our intent, but also to identify kind of some challenges around impact. So a few questions that I encourage faculty and staff to ask, especially when they are the drivers of a particular project. So to start with, have I identified a list of potential community partners that are consistent with the learning outcomes of my course? So again, higher education has started to move away from this, but a really service learning was one of the most problematic pieces of service learning historically has been this idea that any experiential learning is better than classroom learning. That I am here to say is not true. There are a lot of ways to do bad experiential learning that are not helpful to learning outcomes and are not particularly helpful to the community. A challenge we have in community engagement work is that a lot of people, associate community engagement, service, altruism, charity, whatever you call it, with being a good person. And so we become really hesitant to like ask critical questions and to ask if we should be doing it in the first place and who we might be working with. And so I offer this first question because it can help us to identify if like that assignment, where students are just expected to get 10 hours of service as a part of the class with no specification on who they're working with or how they're working with that group, with no relationship between the faculty member and the nonprofit. That can create a lot of challenges. And honestly, I don't think is pedagogically responsible because at the end of the day, students can do service on their own. Faculty can do service on their own. Faculty and staff as individuals, we can all be involved in the community as human beings in the world. When we decide to do it as a function of our role with the institution, there should always be a connection to learning and knowledge and kind of overall growth of our community. So another question is, are potential community partners aware of my course and the potential for interaction with students? I get a lot of phone calls. They're not as frequent, but early in my career, I would get quite a few phone calls from community partners saying, I'm getting a lot of WAKE students and I don't really know why. And they seem really like frantic to get, these hours very quickly. Can you tell me more? What we know just anecdotally and what I've learned from working both teaching community engaged classes, I've taught a few classes at Wake Forest, one on activism and advocacy and one on preparing for community engagement in the education department, is that students will often wait till the last minute to do a lot of their assignments. And that is community service, community engagement is no exception. And so you want to make sure as the faculty or staff lead that you are really shepherding that relationship and that you are really building the relationship with the community partner. Also so that they can share, when students don't show up for things and say that they did, or when there's a miscommunication of expectations. So that relates to whether or not students are clear on how their service work is consistent with their other coursework and the overall learning objectives of the course. Community engagement work is not less rigorous than other scholarship. It is oftentimes more complicated. I will not say it's harder, but definitely more complex because there's less in your control as the person driving it. But often it can get a reputation for being less rigorous because we don't make those clear connections for students on what the experiential opportunity is supposed to be adding to their education or to their knowledge of a particular topic. And I have worked with faculty across disciplines and across disciplinary perspectives. I have worked with faculty where they have an idea for a course and they're like, I want to see how I can make this community engaged, but it is about the history of the country of India. And, have thought, well, that's a really tricky moment. Like, how do we do community-based work or experiential work that's about a community that students can't visit or participate in? And I've found overwhelmingly that those conversations have been productive, that we've been able to find a way to get there, but also that we have to be very explicit and prepared to be explicit around those connections with the students and with the other partners that we're working with. And then the final is this idea of, have I considered opportunities for engaging community partners as co-educators? So whether that's bringing them in as guest lecturers, whether that's doing structured reflections on site, and how am I compensating them for that time and for their knowledge? So some critical questions that students can ask themselves or researchers can ask themselves before they go in. So what skills have I developed with previous volunteer or community-based experiences? And what skills do I have or am I developing? Those kind of hard and soft skills. It's important to think about those things because a lot of times nonprofits will defer and community organizations will defer to folks who are reaching out and say, well, what is it that you would like to do? And so then we can get in this kind of back and forth dance of like, what would you like me to do? What would you like to do? What would you like me to do? It's a bit of a like, who's on first moment. When you take that moment to kind of do a personal inventory, and this comes in to play a little bit later when we talk about asset mapping, when you take that moment, it helps to create a better dialogue, a better discourse around like, how we can be of service. Motivation is also really important for students and for researchers. A key question, and I alluded to this earlier, is what populations will I be working with, and am I culturally prepared to work in this context? I believe that if you are going to work with students and have them work in community engaged context, and they are drastically different from the communities that they're serving, it's actually unethical to send them into those communities if they are not prepared to work in that context. And so I have the IDI listed here because that is one framework that you can use to basically kind of map your own identity, your own racial identity and cultural identity, and your kind of positionality towards others. And that can be helpful in really helping students to reflect on whether or not they're actually prepared to work in the communities that they feel called to work in. And it can also be valuable to us as researchers and faculty and administrators. And then finally, any time that you can find a way to get students and researchers to think about strengths that they have, particularly strengths that are maybe not being recognized in other spaces, you're just expanding the potential assets that you can pull. And then some questions for community partnerships. So a lot of these are things you may be able to find on the website, but I find that it's helpful to do a little bit of your own research, but then also just ask for the broad vision from community partners, because it's hard to know what is possible without asking for those things, right? So what are your organization's goals and values? And where do I see this organization? Where do you see this organization in the future? How can my work be a part of that? What kind of work can I be expected to be doing? Can we meet regularly? Is there training you'd like for me to complete before working with your organization? And what does success look like for you? Getting those things kind of clear from the jump can help you to identify where are the spaces that you need to do some additional work, but also what are the expectations for the stakeholder that you're working with. So I wanted to share a little bit about mapping strategies because it is something that I think can be really beneficial early on when we're thinking about developing a portfolio of community-based work. So this is kind of a hybrid, actually, this map that you see in front of you from an organization called Housing Alexandria that actually is both an asset and a power map, which is why I like to use it as just like an overview of mapping. So maps can help us chart the landscape of a community through the things we can see and feel, and through the gifts, skills, and talents in that community. They can also help us name dynamics that we may have witnessed or experienced. They can help us chart a path forward by seeing what assets we have at play. And they can help us see our communities with new eyes and prioritize the outreach so that it's not just from one experience that we had or that we heard about. They can also increase our awareness around the resources at our disposal. And when done well, they can also be an opportunity to build community in and with the communities that we're working with by giving them an opportunity to tell us who they are, as opposed to us kind of making assumptions based off of what we can see from the outside. So asset mapping was originally developed in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern. And it basically provides information about strengths and resources of a community and can help us uncover solutions. Once these strengths are inventoried and depicted in a map, you can better see how to build on those assets and address community needs through things that the community already has. It's a tool that relies on kind of a core belief of asset-based community development, which is that good things exist in communities and that those things can be highlighted and discouraged or encouraged. This is very different from kind of more historical approaches to community development work that start with a needs assessment. So a needs assessment is an assessment where you kind of catalog all of the problems with a community, and an asset map is one where you start with what are the strengths in this community and how can we leverage them, and it really centers the leadership that already exists in a community. Participatory asset mapping is a process where community members collectively create asset maps by identifying, providing information about their own community. And so I've included a link here to a toolkit for doing participatory asset mapping, because it can be very similar to other kinds of kind of qualitative inquiry and ethnographic inquiry, but it's highly participatory. And so what I have seen, one of the organizations that does the most known for their asset-based community development strategies and structures, Neighbors for Better Neighborhoods, here in Winston-Salem. And they really, in particular, I've seen Kenneth Hawley facilitate this workshop multiple times with community members in neighborhoods that they work with. And they really use participatory asset mapping as a way to build community and build trust, and to center the voices of community members. But again, this is very different. Doing participatory asset mapping takes place over time and is very different from, just asking people who they are and what they need. It's very attentive to transitioning the information from meeting to meeting and to thinking about kind of the what then piece. So the key categories that are often used to discuss when you're doing an asset map are physical assets. So this is going to include land, buildings, transportation, things like that. One of the most notable examples of an asset-based approach to, again, food security is I always confuse the acronym, but I believe it's the Black Church Food Sovereignty Network in Baltimore. They have been working with Black churches in historically Black neighborhoods to leverage the land that they sit on as spaces to grow food, and the commercial kitchens that they own as spaces that could be shared use kitchens. So that's a great example of asset-based community development in the context of physical assets. A lot of times we may not think about things that we have as assets because we can't wholly transfer ownership to another entity. But if we can create space where people could use it, then it can be really valuable. Economic assets are included, but they are only one of the 7, which is a notable difference from needs assessments, which tend to really focus on monetary resources and economic resources in a community. And economic assets in the context of asset-based community development includes what residents produce and consume in the community, both in formal and informal ways. So that could be local businesses. It also may be bartering and trading relationships, things like that. Stories are considered a key asset in asset-based community development, and I know you've already talked a lot around how that can manifest in the humanities, because they carry the memory of a community, and they can describe the potential of a community based off of what folks who live there remember. Local residents are a key asset. Those who live in the community, their skills, experiences, their capacity, their passion, their willingness to contribute. And that local residents are often in discussions of asset-based community development like a key touchstone. Everything kind of falls apart in the asset-based community development framework without people power. Similarly, local associations like athletic clubs, faith-based groups, social organizations Local institutions are one of these. So this can include public spaces in the community like schools, libraries, and parks. It can include government institutions. It can include nonprofits. The important thing is that institutions are really one of 7 in an asset-based framework, whereas a lot of times in community development work, more traditional community development work, they are the primary kind of driver of a lot of changes. And then I've actually added local grassroots groups because I don't think, I don't think that grassroots organizing and associations are the same thing. And so I've added this as kind of an outgrowth of local associations because they may be even more informal or formal, but really thinking about activists that are just showing up for things. I think we've seen that in this particular moment in social movements around Black Lives Matter, is that there are a lot of groups and a lot of individual activists that were active behind the scenes and now are really coming into more visibility in our communities. And this is a key kind of transition or connection point to power mapping. So power mapping is, and many of you may have done this before, it's a framework for problem solving through relationship building that analyzes power relationships in various forms of capital. Like asset mapping, it can give you a better picture of who the players are in a community, what the context is of that community, and where you might plug in. So it reveals avenues of influence that are available to an organization or cause. It captures and maps key forms of capital like social, political, economic. Relational capital is sometimes mapped separately from social. It reveals webs of connections in a community or a movement. And so it also helps us to kind of break out of the thinking that everything is connected in a hierarchy or that it's clean in any way. Communities are not clean. They're messy and sometimes and often disorganized or may seem disorganized to us. And there's a lot of different relationships and connection points, and power mapping can help us see those. It was originally power mapping, and probably most notably power mapping, is used in a legislative context. So I have here like a nice little primer, I think, on legislative power mapping that I've used in the past, or that I've seen in the past as well in kind of organizing spaces. And that often focuses on individuals. But I wanted to include it because when you add it to asset mapping, it can also illuminate kind of who the major players are in a particular issue or area and who you might be able to learn from, participate with, engage with. So I wanted to end kind of my presentation portion with some tips for effectiveness that I've observed both through my own work and mistakes and successes, and through working with faculty and with students and with organizers. So the first is show up before you have to. If there is something that I hear most in my work, it is critiques of higher education and the fact that we don't show up until we've gotten a grant and we have money to spend and we need to spend it in a particular way, or until we've gotten IRB or we're about to apply for IRB and we have a research protocol and we want to insert organization here, right? That is increasingly not well received. It never really garnered a ton, like excellent outcomes, but increasingly community partners that we work with, both from our institution and from what I hear from colleagues at other institutions, are just they're not here for that. And it pragmatically also means you have to do a lot of catching up before you can engage. So if there's something that aligns with your research, if there's an organization that you're interested in, I always encourage folks to show up. Just go to the Zoom for now, right? But when we're back in person, hopefully at some point, like, go to the rally, go to the talk, go to the workshop, introduce yourself. if you feel comfortable, learn a little bit before you have a reason, a stated reason that you have to be there. Engage your on-campus and community partners as thought partners. And so this was a place for me to just plug really briefly our website, the Office of Civic and Community Engagement. Here you'll find a lot of resources that you are welcome to use. We have a full resources tab to like organizations, trainings and workshops, things like that. We are doing a lot of work with virtual engagement. You can learn more about that here. One thing that's new to our work, because about a year ago, about this time last year, we were relaunching this office with a recentered focus on community partnerships and community partnership development. And we developed this Ways to Partner page that I think can be helpful for you, for other organizations that you might, for other projects that you might want to do. In particular, we went through and did an audit of our own resources. So what are physical, using an asset-based approach, what are physical resources, volunteer resources, knowledge and academic resources that we think we could already pretty much provide, either in a formal way or an informal relationship, if a nonprofit needed or wanted it. And what this has been intended to do and has done for us over the last year is it's removed the kind of gatekeeping function that a lot of times offices of community engagement or public engagement can kind of function as, and that institutions of higher education are incredibly complex. And I say all the time that it is not the job of community members to know the difference between one office and another office, between one department and another department, between a student organization and an administrative entity. That's not their job. And so instead, we kind of are trying to meet community partners where they are and be upfront in identifying what some of the assets are that we think we can potentially provide. Another thing that's important is to cite your sources. So always share credit and amplify excellent work. I like to encourage folks to think about if you were going to talk about community-based work, if you're going to talk about something you did in partnership with a nonprofit, you should just get in the practice of naming everyone, naming all the partners every time you talk about the work. And if that's not something you can do or feel comfortable doing, you might want to reflect on whether or not community engaged work is the best path for you. Another kind of tip is to look at other models. So some of you may be familiar with Campus Compact. Campus Compact was founded as a national organization that was kind of a professional organization initially to connect presidents of universities and administrative and faculty who were doing community engagement work with each other. We have a North Carolina Campus Compact. There are state compacts across the country, but National Campus Compact has what I think is a pretty underutilized resource, which is this resource tab. And in this resource tab, there's knowledge hubs for different types of knowledge. So you can see there's, all of these kind of topics that are largely faculty led, but have balance between faculty, community partner, and staff leadership, and just folks wanting to think about particular topics with colleagues from across the country. Another thing to look at is the syllabi. I think can be really helpful because, as you can see, you can actually, this is all open source, and so you can actually search for particular disciplines, types of instruction, type of institution, type of service, issue area, and then when you click on these courses, you will get the syllabi from the syllabi archive, but what you will also get with the large majority of these is contact information for the faculty member who's taught that class in the past and has submitted it to be included as a part of that kind of repository. And so that is something I always direct folks to, because I think it can just be a really nice way to kind of get the juices flowing and see what others have done, and to reach out to colleagues at other institutions, or maybe even in your institution that you didn't know were doing that work. So be strategic and realistic about timelines and outcomes again, and be prepared to be transparent about setbacks and collective in celebration. So opening up again those communication channels so that folks can really share the impact of the work, whether it is positive or negative, and being transparent around university timelines, being prepared to educate people on like what different acronyms mean, right? And like what is realistic, even if, you know, it may move slower than they hope. So that is the end of my kind of presentation. And exactly 15 minutes for questions. I think that is the only time in my entire life that I have kept exactly 15 minutes at the end. So I will, I think, gonna have a little help around the questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Shelley. That was wonderful and enlightening, and I have so much to process now. I am Jessica Wilson-Saya. I am the digital, I'm a developer for digital scholarship at Z. Smith Reynolds Library, and I'll be facilitating the Q&A session. Looks like we have one question down in the Q&A, but it is a really good one. Keeping congruency between course learning objectives and community engagement in mind, do you recommend that faculty work with one or very few community partners over a long period of years versus working with several partners on a more short-term basis based on a semester? I can see pros and cons with both approaches, but I worry that the cons outweigh the pros for the short-term work as it relates to issues of trust, relationship building, and who benefits more from the work. I love that question.
Whoever asked that question is welcome to join me as a co-facilitator in the future, because that is the question of community engagement. It is one of the key questions of community engagement in higher education. So I am, as is my way, I'm going to give you my opinion and also acknowledge that it's not everyone's opinion, but I'm going to share mine because I'm doing the presentation. So I think it's an excellent question. And I would say, first, before fully answering it, that what it raises for me is something that I do not think we are honest enough about in higher education, that we must be honest about to do good community engaged work. Oh, it was Roe Kirby Straker. Of course it was. Dr. Kirby Straker and I have co-facilitated workshops in the past, so that is not surprising to me. Great. So I think that it can depend. I think that what I was going to acknowledge is that it takes a lot of labor to do this work well and a lot of time. And ideally, and hopefully, the role of folks like me at your institution is to help kind of carry some of the relational work and some of the trust building work so that every time a faculty member wants to do engagement with the community, they and the community partner do not have to spend hours upon hours of building trust and relationships. And so that is why, you know, some of the recommendations I made around like being clear about outcomes, being clear about timelines, I think can shift what the project can look like. I think that the bulk, what you are going to get out of it should be congruent with the amount of time that you're going to put in. And so I'll say a little bit more about that. In general, my response is build relationships with one or two organizations over time and see where that goes. That is in general my response. I think Dr. Kirby Straker hit it perfectly in asking about trust and accountability, right? You can't get to trust and accountability like from the jump. You particularly cannot get to that if you represent an institution that has been problematic in the lives of the people that you are working with. And so, you know, that means that you need to create that relationship that allows for the space for people to share the impact of an institution or their history with an institution with you, and for you to be able to hear that, even if you can't do anything about it. And so in general, my default answer is to start with one organization. And because all community work, I think, is a ripple, right? The likelihood that if your work is strong with that one organization, that you are going to start getting outreach from other organizations is very high. And so just because you're starting with one organization and kind of moving out doesn't mean you're like limited to just that organization. The caveat to that is having honest conversations with the organizations you want to work with around the amount of labor that they have to put into the project. And so the ways the one caveat where that can shift is like, say you're teaching a class on listening, because Dr. Kirby Straker has taught a class on listening that is community engaged. And you know that you want students to gain certain skill sets around listening, documenting, taking notes, qualitative inquiry, that kind of thing. When we worked together on her class, Dr. Kirby Straker had her class work with several different organizations because no one organization really had the capacity to support 20 students at once in a semester. And so they all had similar projects that they were doing, but they were doing it for different organizations. And so I think that's where that relationship piece really comes into play. That can get a little unwieldy for the faculty member, which is a big part of why I usually advocate for, starting with one organization and kind of building out. But that is an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, and we've had another one come in. When beginning to work with a new community partner, would you recommend the more specific power and asset mapping rather than a more general needs assessment? I've seen templates that do not get at the granular info some of the maps included in your presentation do. Are there suggested ways for how to introduce these tools and their affordances to community partners when you begin working together?
Yeah, so I definitely recommend, I was just reading as you were saying the question, because
I apologize for stuttering in the middle there.
No, you're fine. To understand, I sometimes have to do that. So I think the reason that I shared kind of power asset mapping is because I do think that a lot of times the needs assessment really doesn't get deep enough. And I think that it also is often like, I like to use the metaphor of like, my mother always comes to my house and like starts by commenting on how the floor is dirty and then asks me if I would like for her to clean it. And what I will share with you all is like, the fact that she started by identifying the problem in my house does not make me want her to be the one to solve it. And so I think we have to be very thoughtful when we are doing needs assessments for a community of which we are not a part. It is very tricky for that needs assessment to not be like borderline offensive. And for an organization to say, actually, we're fine with that X, Y, and Z, right? Or a community to say, we're fine that that graffiti is there. We like that graffiti is there. We don't want, everything to look the same, that sort of thing. So we have to be, I think, really aware with, particularly with needs assessments, but also with asset mapping that does not include the community, right, that we're working with. We have to be aware of like how we're kind of grafting our own biases and our own preferences onto what we perceive is a problem with the community or a goal of a community, right? And so I think it's helpful to do that at the beginning. And I think a lot of nonprofits kind of from a community perspective, like a community partner perspective, actually are more aware often of asset-based community development than we are in the academy. So while it came out of Northwestern, the way it came out of Northwestern was very much more of like a grounded theory type situation where these faculty members were doing work in the School of Education in the South Side of Chicago and realized that the way they were doing the work was not effective and that they didn't know what they needed to know to be effective in that community. And so they started working on asset mapping and starting with that and inviting people in to kind of identify what they were prepared to leverage and offer to their community. And then what they realized was there was a lot of solutions within their own community, kind of more recently, the language of mutual aid, right, is what is often used. That there were these mutual aid solutions and interventions that they could find that didn't require an institution to come in with a ton of funding and a ton of expectations around how that funding was allowed to be spent, right? And so I think kind of it's really just, asset mapping for me is really kind of a narrative approach to looking at a community, to doing an assessment of what a community has to offer. And so, yeah, I do recommend it at the beginning. I think some of the questions I provided for community partners are intended to really talk about those, to really identify some of those pieces, some of those points. But the links that I provided as well will take you to toolkits. There's actually a full, and I should have put this link in there, and I can share it with you, Carrie and Molly, later. But if you Google it, you will also find it. The ABCD Institute, Asset-Based Community Development Institute, is online, and there's bukus of toolkits that you can download that help you walk through. They're prompting guides, facilitation guides for doing an asset map. And so they provide some of that. What is an asset map? How do you do it? What are examples of them? Thank you. Yes, thank you, Molly. So the faculty who originally started at Northwestern have moved to DePaul. And so there is a whole center at DePaul.
Thank you so much. While you were talking about that, I was reminded of an experience I had when I worked at a museum, and we had foundations coming to us all the time. Never provided what we needed because they didn't know. So I think it's a very real thing, and I really appreciate you talking about that, because it's hard for people in academia to sometimes understand that that's an issue. I was nodding vigorously throughout your answer.
And I appreciate you naming that, because what I'm sure you've experienced, I've also been on the partner side. I worked in nonprofit before I worked in housing before I came to Wake to work at Wake. And I'm sure you've had this experience, because there also is often this frustration almost that you're not ready to just jump at the money, or you're you don't have it together enough, and it's maybe we're not asking questions that we need to be asking, or maybe these funding priorities are no longer relevant, right? Or maybe this research project is no longer the thing I need to be doing. And I think that's the sometimes uncomfortable truth of community-based work, is that you have to pivot, and that's a little risky, can be a little risky, can feel a little risky. Yeah.
I think we have time. The previous question actually kind of answered one of the ones that I had prepared for this, which was are there key points that could determine what kind of a mapping an organization or a project should use over another at any given point in their relationship with the organization? But I think you addressed that pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because what it raises is that, again, this is iterative and it's going to shift over time. So what I like about asset mapping and power mapping, and what some people dislike, but I feel in the humanities, I'll be among friends, or in faculty, I'll be among friends, is this idea that it's going to change over time, and it's a living document. So as relationships shift, as priorities shift, as openings shift in a community, as whatever the topic of the time is shifts, you're going to be changing that. And I keep going back to food, because I spent my first 7 years working at Wake, specifically doing our food work, our food kind of outreach work through the campus kitchen, but a little more broadly. And that was a time period where that landscape was rapidly shifting, because there were several national studies that had come out, and recently a study has come out around economic mobility in Forsyth County. But these studies talked about we're ranking Forsyth County in the bottom 5 to, top bottom three around food security for young children. And a lot of times what I see is those pieces, those kind of, national analyses, like data reports, can start a conversation in a community that we then need to be prepared to meet, right? And so like, then it can create real discourse around a particular issue at that moment. And we have the ability to kind of both think about it historically, but also think about like how our individual disciplines can contribute to a particular issue, because no one does anything by themselves. And so the sooner that we kind of let go of that idea of like, I as an independent researcher am going to, solve food security or whatever it may be, the more successful we're going to be. So that would be what I would offer, my last piece.
Thank you so much for that. That was very wonderfully stated.
Thank you, Jessica.
Well, that's all we have time for today. And thank you so much, Shelley, for joining us. I think that the last word being nobody does anything by themselves is a great way to conclude our DH at Wake Summer Institute community and collections theme this year. And so I just want to thank everybody for attending. This is our first year of holding this event via webinar and opening it up beyond Wake Forest. So thank you everyone at Wake Forest and beyond for joining us. Special thanks to the Z. Smith Reynolds Library for sponsoring the event and the Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communication team for organizing. And I'm grateful to all of our presenters, and it is my hope that this can be a starting point for our community engaged digital humanities projects in the Winston-Salem region and beyond, and any interinstitutional projects that this event sparked. I'm excited to hear more from all of you. Everyone that's attended,